stewarding Cherokee and Catawba land in Fairview, North Carolina, on a new and small regenerative farm in Western North Carolina outside of Asheville. And I'm really pleased to have the chance to get to share some ideas that I've been thinking about for a while. I've been trying to think about the first Shemitah cycle that I began thinking and learning and teaching about Shemitah. And the ways in which we have kind of grown, I want to say, in the last three Shemitah cycles. And so I kind of just think back to what your life was 20 years ago. 20 years ago, 21 years next year. What was going on in your life? What was going on in the world? What was going on in your awareness of the impact between environment and food production and economies, right? And then move from that space of 20 years ago and fast forward 7 years, right? And so thinking back now, what was going on in your life, in the world, your awareness of those relationships. And we move forward now up until today and think about, I'm thinking now about the ways in which the ways in which Shemitah was taught to me now seem misplaced and insufficient to become a useful mechanism, right? And so I want to be really clear that my interest in what I'm sharing tonight is not about replicability. It's not about looking at the world of our ancestors so many Shemitah cycles ago and try and replicate, because the relationship between agriculture and economy and humanity and creation was different. And so looking at the wisdom that's inherent in the values of these traditions and trying to understand what are they seeking to address. And through that process, try and look at the framework that we live in today in the Shemitah cycle about to begin 5782, coming the fall of 2021. And how do we wrestle with the challenges that we face, and what wisdom can we glean? And I'm using that word, pun intended. What wisdom can we glean from our ancestors in how we approach the challenges that we have today, right? And so questions around, like, do we observe it outside the land of Israel, and like, do we have to follow the law according to what the Torah says, are not interesting to me right now in this context. And I'm going to assume that the folks who are here have at least a general understanding of what Shemitah is. But just in case, just to put us all on the same page of the aspects of it that I'm focused on this evening, is there is instruction in the Torah to every 7 years, and this is a universal counting of 7, not a personal counting of 7, so the entire community observes the same cycles. The land is required to stay fallow to a certain degree, and all debt is released. These two things do not happen simultaneously. I think we often might have it in our mind that this happens at the same time. It does not. The land is required to be in the process of becoming fallow as the year before Shemitah is ending. So there's even a limitation at the end of the 6th year. And the release of debts doesn't happen until Rosh Hashanah after the Shemitah year, right? So the economic release does not happen simultaneous to the agricultural release. The economic release happens afterwards, and the agricultural release happens a little bit before, right? And so the structures of this agricultural and economic release had and continue to have an immediate impact on the lives of the people for whom it is relevant, which today is a very small number of people. At the time in antiquity, it was also a very small number of people, and at times much less than now. So I'm also not really interested in what contemporary farming in Israel around Shemitah looks like for the topic of this conversation. But I think what we often forget, and what I have not witnessed spoken about to, I think, a sufficient degree, is the other structures, the other systems that are essential to the structures of mutual aid, let's call it, in ancestral Jewish tradition, that aren't just adjacent to or alongside Shemitah, but are part of its actual structure. And so rather than think of Shemitah as this kind of like foundational essence of Jewish agricultural and economic wisdom, to me, it's really the apex. And without those structures, there's no reason to even be talking about Shemitah, right? That until we can get to that foundational place, there's no reason to even address it. So the ways in which we are presented with the question of what Shemitah is and how are we going to experience it, that the Torah presents is with this question that expresses anxiety. And to me, that's just a fascinating, oops, sorry about that. Did not want to do that. It's a fascinating aspect of the, to me, the brilliance of what the Torah is actually teaching us, not from a spiritual or religious, from a place of application of values and an expression of values. And so that the Torah presents Shemitah with this question of anxiety, this question of fear, of lack, tells us something about the mindset that of the context of the values that we're seeking to apply. It's one of the challenges that we're seeking to address, right? And so in looking at what that anxiety looks like, what does the anxiety look like of not being able to control our food sources? And so how do we create systems of, again, I'm going to use the term mutual aid, that ensure that by the time we get to a place in which that anxiety might be paralyzing, we have enough of a structure to rely upon that anxiety is at least mitigated. I want to encourage folks to use the chat function if things come up in the course of this conversation. It's really hard to have like meaningful, quick exchange that I think we're all kind of used to in these settings in Zoom with mutes, with everyone being muted and all of that. So please, like if things come up, chime in. And there's only a few of us, so we can probably manage an actual conversation if folks are willing and interested in that. So the place that we have to begin is with this question of what will we eat in the seventh year, right? So in the context in which you are living in a semi-urban agrarian society, which is to say that people live in close proximity to one another in dense but small environments that are adjacent to agricultural resources. And so the distance between agriculture and urban life is minimal. And so we really have to shift our understanding, because most of us today live either with access to agriculture or in an urban environment. And we don't have them adjacent to each other. And so it's important, I think, for us to recognize the context in which this anxiety is being presented. And so the Torah presents this question, and it's not a question if you say, but when, right? When you come to this place and you recognize, oh my goodness, there is a year without growing food. What will we eat in the 7th year when we cannot sow and we cannot gather our produce? And the response is, I will command my blessing for you in the 6th year. It will make produce for 3 years. You'll sow in the 8th year. You'll eat from the old produce until the 9th year. And then the produce comes and you'll eat what was old. And it, I think, is so easy for us to read this as divine intervention, that God is going to somehow cause this miraculous triple fold bumper harvest that like is not real, right? And feels foolish. And I want to say that so much of this is lost in translation, and so much of our relationship to Torah in translation is through the lens of the kind of structures of Christian hegemony that we live under. And English itself is influenced by Christianity. And so when we hear the word blessing, we immediately are going to kind of, this is now categorized into religion and spirituality. My sense is that when the Torah uses the language of blessing, what it's talking about is stability. Right, that what it's talking about is this notion. Think about in the creation story when it says that, you know, God looks at everything that's created and sees that it's good, right? That it's good, and then gets to a place where God sees that it's very good, and then God blesses it. And so that notion of good and bad, that kind of dichotomy, right? If something is good, then it's stable. And so that inclination towards bad destabilizes us, right? So I'm kind of thinking about good and bad and blessing and curse, not in these religious spiritual senses, but more in a psychological sense. What does it mean to be a human living in an unstable world? And agriculture inherently, especially in the lack of interventions that our ancestors would have had by virtue of technology, right? That anxiety is so real. I mean, I can tell you literally last summer, I wept over tomatoes that were so abundant and so glorious. And within a week, hundreds of tomato plants in our farm were dead, right? And we knew it was going to happen. You can't grow tomatoes in Western North Carolina and have them not succumb to blight if they're outside, right? But it's still, it's so anxiety ridden. And so imagine when it's not just like a farm that's able to buy seeds in packets, but this is your actual sustenance. You have no grocery store to go to. So the idea of this blessing in the 6th year is to say, listen, there are structures that can stabilize your experience before. You can prepare for Shemitah. At a certain point in the years of talking about Shemitah in the last 20 years, I remember having a conversation with Nigel Savage, the founder of Chazon, where we both were kind of laughing of like, why do we only talk about Shemitah in the Shemitah year? Shouldn't we be talking about Shemitah for 6 years and then stop talking about Shemitah in the Shemitah year, right? Like, we need to prepare for these things, not reflect on them as they happen. So this idea of the blessing coming in the 6th year, I want to say we can read as you have structures that you can put into place to ensure that you will have produce for 3 years, that you will have stability. And so putting the frame of these years in the 1st year, 3rd year, 7th year, the 9th year, what are they talking about? The 1st year of what? The 3rd year of what, right? These are all the Shemitah cycles. And so putting it into the cycle itself, that you're going to sow in the 8th year being the 1st year. So if you plan for Shemitah in the 1st year of the Shemitah cycle, then you will have, and you do this repeatedly, you will have storage from the previous cycle. Then you don't have to worry about not being able to grow enough food in that 8th year by the 9th year, when your stores are depleted, you'll have food. At that point, the land will begin to give of its fruit, right? Once you have a active growing space and the land is receiving the nutrients that it needs, then it provides the nutrients that it needs. And so if you can sustain your crops, then you will eat satisfactorily. And if you eat satisfactorily, you will reside securely, meaning that if you don't have the anxiety of hunger, you're not going to be divided amongst each other. And so that basic security of being able to live will be yours. At that point, we're in the 5th year of the cycle. And then if you have your structures in place and the hunger that is potential always in society is at least responded to, then you'll be able to have preparation for the 7th year, in which you're going to want to say, what will we eat? Right? And so taking this frame in the Torah and then putting it into a nonlinear frame, for me, has proven very useful to try and understand a different lens to see the relevance of Shemitah for us. Any questions, comments about the Torah text before we move on? Okay. So in Pirkei Avot, which is collection of wisdom literature that became attached to the Mishnah, which is legal literature, composed between the 2nd and 3rd century, oral traditions dating back until arguable past dates. And there is this teaching that spells out this kind of idea of pestilence increasing at different times of the year. And again, I think we can read this as a kind of spiritual reward punishment text, or we can look at it as a statement on the public health crises that occur because of poverty, right? That disease and unwellness is directly linked to poverty. And the more entrenched poverty is in a society, then even those who are not experiencing poverty are still adjacent to that unwellness, right? And so it's an aspect of economic inequality that I think we often kind of like to push off to the side and not address, that poverty is very much a public health issue. And so the idea that in the 4th year and in the 7th year, and also the year after the 7th year, there is this more abject poverty and hunger, because of the phenomenon that when people have, they are more likely to protect. And when people don't have, they're more likely to share what they do. Right? And this is kind of a nearly universal human phenomenon that has different degrees of severity in different contexts. But the idea of someone who is resourced is less likely to share their resources when they feel the anxiety of not having those resources. Whereas someone who does not have access to resources is more likely to share those with other people who don't have access. And so in the 4th year, right, in the 4th year of the Shemitah cycle is the year following the time when people should have been giving an additional tax to the poor in the community for their sustenance. And so if you have greater levels of abject poverty in that year, there will also be greater levels of disease and unwellness. And the same goes for the Shemitah year, because of the 6th year, when the tax to the poor was to have been given, and also in the 8th year, because everyone is living in a state of relative poverty in the Shemitah year. And so again, being able to frame these texts, not through the lens of some kind of divine ordained punishment, but as a recognition of the ramification of living in an economy that is inherently unstable and unbalanced and unjust. And I also want to name and remind us that our ancestors are not living in systems of capitalism, that their economic structures are not our economic structures, that our aspects of economic injustice are perhaps the same in some cases as theirs, but not necessarily for the same reasons. And so I again want to name that I'm not looking for replicability in these ideas, but what are the values that are being presented here? And this idea of the month after Sukkot, right? So and this doesn't mean the month of Cheshvan, it means for the 30 days, right? For the moon cycle, full moon to full moon, the full moon of Tishrei through the full moon of Cheshvan, through the full moon of the month that Sukkot begins on the full moon until 1 month from that point, right? That idea of what happens when the food that is harvested is not distributed equitably. Right? And so Sukkot is this kind of deeply meaningful, incredible, equalizing ritual that is also, on a certain level, deeply offensive when you compare the experience of those that are resourced to the experience of those that are not. That the whole idea of Sukkot, of exposing ourselves to vulnerability intentionally, to remind ourselves of the vulnerability of life, of the joy of the harvest in the face of that vulnerability. But then to realize that some people are playing homeless for a week, right? And some people are living in a shelter that they otherwise wouldn't have access to, because when it's not Sukkot, they don't have access to a shelter, right? So there's this equalizing force of Sukkot that is also artificial. And so the idea of really highlighting, right? And I think in rabbinic literature, there's a tendency, something that is last is presented for impact, right? That they had, I believe, highly structured narrative in their literature, even in the Mishnah, even in their legal writing, highly structured narrative. So the idea of really emphasizing that at Sukkot each year, there is an expectation of a certain percentage of produce is not gifted, given in the sense of transmitted to the poor, meaning that the food that they are being given access to at the harvest at Sukkot is not, and the other festivals of harvest as well at Passover and Shavuot, that the food that they are being given access to is not a gift, and it is not charity, right? Charity is not mutual aid. It is not a gift. It is transmitting ownership because the food was already theirs. The farmer is growing the food on land that the farmer is stewarding, but the food, a certain percentage of it, belongs to the poor in the community. And so the idea then that the Mishnah in Pirkei Avot is responding to the Torah and saying, these things that people are supposed to do, they don't do. And when they don't do them, there are ramifications. And when those ramifications become entrenched, then the level of inequality in society is even more problematic. Right? So tithes, to me, when I mentioned that Shemitah is not the foundation of Jewish agricultural and economic wisdom, it's the culmination. If there is a foundation, from my personal opinion, it's maaser. It's the act of tithing. The word maaser literally means, it's like turning the word 10 into a verb, right? So it's like to actively tenth something. So this idea of taking 10% of produce, certain kinds of produce, and separating it out for different designated purposes, right? These are taxes. And there are three types of maaser. There are three types of tithes, and two of those tithes are given each year of a 3-year tithing cycle. When you put two of those tithing cycles together, you end up with the 6 years of the 7-year Shemitah cycle. So in year 1 and year 4, year 2 and year 5, they're giving specific tithes, and we'll get into what these tithes are in a moment. And in year 3 and year 6, specific tithes. And I'm actually realizing that this has a typo, and I apologize for that. And in all 3 years of the cycle, this should say Rishon. So I apologize for that oversight. Copy and paste is not always a great way to produce documents. So there's Maaser Rishon, the first tithe, right? I won't waste the time to edit the rest of it now. Maaser Rishon, the first tithe in each of the 3 years, and then in the first and second year, the second tithe, and in the third and sixth year, the tithe to the poor. And there are no tithes in the Shemitah year, obviously, because there is no harvest in the Shemitah year. The tithes are presented in the Torah in different places and is really kind of ambiguous and unclear, right? That like if you didn't have an understanding of these other structures and you just read these verses, it's not so easy to really understand even that there's 3 of them, right? If you just read these side by side, there's nothing inherent that tells you on the surface that these are 3 separate tithes, right? And so it gets a little bit confusing, but what the 3 tithes are, the first tithe is given to the Levi'im. It's given to the Levites, who are a family caste that is required to tend to the needs of the priests and their rituals. And so they live in a landless reality and subsist on alms, tithes, gifts, and anywhere else that they can get their food. But since they cannot own land, their tribe was not their allotted land, then the families don't have access to long-term agricultural space. And so they rely on what others produce. But the exchange, and it literally says in the Torah, names it as an exchange for their service. Their service is the maintenance of the temple or the tabernacle before, and the idea of like the centering force of the community. And so when we think about what is the corollary kind of aspect of what that institution was, what the institution of the Levi'im, of the Levites, was for our ancestors, we also have communal institutions that bond us and bind us and support us. And so we support them. And so Maaser Rishon, the first tithe, is about supporting communal institutions. The second tithe to me is really, really interesting. And I also want to name that the 10%, right? So the 10% of the first tithe is actually taken after a different percentage of produce is taken out that's going to be given to the priests. Not relevant to this conversation. So it's not 10% of the total harvest. And then the second tithe is 10% of what's left, right? So each time the percentage is of a smaller amount. So there is a system of, it needs to be fair for the farmer also. The second tithe is taken after the first tithe is taken, and it is for the farmer themselves and their families to take to Jerusalem, and needs to be eaten inside of the city of Jerusalem, but not at the temple precinct. There are other commanded foods that need to be eaten within the temple precinct, but this does not, which means you don't need to be in a state of ritual purity. And so people who are going to Jerusalem for the festivals, think about it as like the reverse potluck, right? This is everyone is coming together for a huge communal meal, but you bring your own food for you and your family, right? It's like how gluten-free people go to potlucks. So the idea of like taking a part of your harvest and bringing it to your central communal gathering, right? So the second tithe is all about supporting community gathering. You don't get to eat this at home, you have to eat it at the party. So those are each given in the first and second and the fourth and the fifth year. In the third year, the first tithe supporting the Levi'im is given, the communal institutions, and then the poor tithe, which is not any different than it was for our ancestors as it is today. We have many vulnerable people in our communities. And so looking at this structure of tithes and the way in which it is related to the Shemitah cycle, I think is an essential component for me, at least, in understanding the application of some of these ideas. Any questions about tithing? Any comments or reactions that folks might have about tithing? Okay. Like I said, feel free to use the chat. I'm just going to name that my lights are flickering. I don't know if you can see that. It is so windy here right now. It's not impossible that I might lose power during the presentation. If that's the case, I'm very sorry and we'll reschedule again. So hopefully it won't happen. As I mentioned before, there are these gifts of these givings of produce to the poor in the community. And so looking at this system of, again, mutual aid, this is not charity, as addressing issues of just food distribution, right? Of trying to accomplish equitable food distribution. That today, even more so than in the ancient world, and also true for parts of the ancient Near East, hunger was not a product of a lack of food, but a lack of distribution. Right? That issue is even more dramatic now, but it was also the case in the ancient empires of Egypt and Assyria and the Hittites and the Babylonians and Akkadians, and Israel itself existed in the sea of those empires, and usually as some type of vassal state of one form or another to these empires. And so important also to understand that these structures are coming in, let's say, semi-autonomous societies that are heavily influenced economically, militaristically, and otherwise by larger, more influential empires. So also, I think, an important part of the story. So these different givings are derived from different commandments in the Torah. They more or less come in the same passages. The text that I presented from Pirkei Avot had this phrase at the end that in the month after Sukkot there would be pestilence because of stealing from what is to be given to the needy, and doesn't specify what that means in the Mishnah. And Rambam, Maimonides, in his commentary on the Mishnah, explicitly defines this as leket, shchicha, peah, peret, and olelot. These are the 5 agricultural gifts that are isolated at harvest. And I think some are perhaps more well-known than others. Peah is, I think, one of the more well-known of these, the idea that you have to leave a corner of your field. The corner is not actually a corner, it's a euphemistic corner, but the idea that there is food that is still attached to the ground, that while it's still in the ground, standing grain is designated as this will come to belong to the poor. And it is grown from the beginning with the intention that it explicitly belongs to the poor. And so the reason that it needs to be on a corner, meaning that they have to have access to it. Doesn't mean that they are harvesting it themselves, but as it is grown and they see it designated for them before it's harvested. And that's essential to understanding Peah. Leket, gleaning, is the produce that is falling while the act of harvest is happening. Shchicha, the forgotten sheaves, is after that harvested, after those harvested grain stalks are bundled up and stacked and waiting to be moved to the threshing floor, that some might get left, right? Anyone who's ever been involved in a large scale harvest, even in your garden, let alone on a farm or in a grain field, things get left behind. And if something is left and then you realize it later, you can't necessarily go back and get it. Peret is the specific to olives that olive trees are beaten in various ways, and the idea of going back and picking all of the things off of the tree that didn't come off in the initial harvest through, you leave, and olelot are more specific to grapes, and the bunches of grapes that are not really yet ready for harvest, they are to be left and not harvested after, once they do ripen, but left for the needy. And the idea of these, I think, is important to recognize that, and there are nuanced and specific laws relevant to all of these that we don't have to get into. But the idea that at every point in the harvest, from the time that food is grown to the time that food is gathered to the time that food is processed, people who don't have food have access to what is deemed as less important by the producers. Right. And so I think that then to instill in the awareness in the food producers that this might be less important for the economic output, it is not less important to the sustenance input. And so to know from the get-go that you are planting food that you will not consume and you will not sell, but is essential to treat as if it's no different, or in some cases more carefully than the other foods. And again, if we look at the nuance of those laws, there is a constant attempt in the Mishnah to balance the weight on the recipient of these agricultural gifts and the farmers themselves. The Talmud, to me, is not only a great place to look for debate and interesting legal discussions, but also has interesting stories. And sometimes those stories are presented in legal debates and they're not always so separate. And so they're to me, this text from Bava Metzia, which is a collection of laws and debates about those laws about tort law and damages, this text of almost like the choreography of what's happening during the process of the collecting of these gifts, and this idea of, okay, who gets to actually go, and who is there, like someone checking bank accounts? Like, who gets to determine who's going? And you have to, again, imagine if you're willing to put the effort into doing this. But what about the people who have to put the effort into doing this but don't have the physical strength to do it? Right? So many people who experience poverty and abject hunger are also experiencing frailty. And that might be why they're experiencing hunger, and it might be why they're experiencing poverty, or their poverty and their hunger might be because a product of their frailty. And so how do you ensure that those people also have access to food? And so at a certain point, all of these things, the food that's left on the ground, it just becomes free for the taking for anybody. So the idea of, like, how do I get to judge at which point I get to take it? I have financial need. I have, like, the ability to feed myself, but I also don't have the ability to feed myself and take care of my other essential needs. And so sometimes I might not be able to have the ability to feed myself. And so there might be a time that I need to walk through that field, but I know I'm not as poor as my neighbor. And so how do I know when I get to go? And this idea of the people who need the extra support, those who are supported by a cane, right? Maybe that's our judge. Like when the people who like just need more time. This Rabbi Reish Lakish, Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, he has this idea of the gleaners who come after the gleaners. And it's important, we think that this means like the really slow ones. It doesn't. These are like when the teams of gleaners come through, when gleaners come through who have like kids picking up after them, right? That's like a whole other level. That's like bag pickers, right? Like there's a whole other level of like when poverty is your job. And so the idea now of when does someone relinquish ownership? Because remember, these foods are theirs. They're not the growers, they're the recipients. The recipient just hasn't received it yet. At what point are they going to say, I'm not even going to go? And here we have this idea that the needy from a different town are going to start going over to this town. Like I remember when I was a kid, like at Halloween, which neighborhood gave out the full-size candy bars, right? And kids would make their parents drive them like 10 minutes down the road for better trick-or-treating, right? That idea of there are people who are traveling because they don't even have enough food in the fields that are in their community. And so we understand now that the complexity of this economic support is way more than just your neighbor going into your field. This is an essential aspect of how a sustainable and balanced and stable economy functions, that when the most vulnerable not have to rely on gifts, but have access through their own agency. And how do we ensure that? So part of the relationship between the agricultural reality and the economic reality we're so separate from today. It's no less present today. We just don't experience it today, right? Because the way that we receive our foods, the way that we purchase foods is so detached that I think we feel as if the relationship between the marketplace and the farms feels more separate today. It's not, right? Like the difference is in how are those marketplaces regulated or not and manipulated or not, and from what values are they being manipulated? Because every marketplace is manipulated, right? Like this whole GameStop stock market Robinhood app thing, I'm assuming people know what I'm talking about, is like a perfect example of like regulation in the unregulated market and so forth. So the idea then of like, how do you regulate for equity? And the essential component, if we want to break it down to values, not application of laws and things like that, but just into values, the essential value inherent in the Torah's presentation of economics is empathy. That the foundational attitude of an economy should be empathy. The foundational text, the foundational commandment of how the marketplace is to be run. And when they say the marketplace, they don't just mean the shuk, right? They don't just mean the place that you're buying your vegetables and like and whatever. They mean the marketplace. This was a complex economy, a trading and lending economy, right? Shemitah cancels debts. This is a trading and lending economy. That it is juxtaposed to the experience of the immigrant and the idea of the experience of empathy. And inherent in economics is the cyclical nature, right? John Prine said it best, that's the way the world goes round. You're up one day, the next you're down, right? That's it. The capitalism, one of the things that capitalism is actually very good at is once you get the money, holding on to it, right? Like one thing that capitalism has really nailed is like holding on to your resources once you have them. Getting them, that's a different conversation. But the idea here is not about holding on to resources, but about distributing resources. And not to say it's socialism, because it's not. This is a different, totally different political and economic reality. But the idea of being unjust to the vulnerable in society and having an unjust marketplace for the Torah go hand in hand. And so if you have an unjust marketplace, it will inherently impact the most vulnerable in society. And if you are unjust to the vulnerable in society over here, then you will also be unjust to them in the marketplace. And then you are essentially creating harm for them, not just ignoring them, but creating harm for them. And so the idea of equity, and I use equity for the word tzedek, right? We often hear it translated as just or righteous, and to me those don't really get to it. The word tzedek, so in Semitic etymology, Tzidku was the Akkadian deity of justice, and the symbol of Tzidku was balanced scales. Right, so the idea of tzedek is equity. Tzedakah, not charity. It is the obligated giving to achieve equity. Tzedakah is unique, and we'll get to it in a minute. But the idea of having equitable marketplaces, right? And so we see that through the tradition, and I just happened to bring Maimonides again, but there are many other places in the tradition to look for, but I think this is kind of shocking to contemporary American Jews. Jewish law stipulates that the maximum profit for non-essential goods is 1/6. It's a very different marketplace than we live in, right? Like, of fixing prices is an essential component to an equitable marketplace because of the inherent inequity in access to food resources. And I also want to name that ancient Israelite society was not a land ownership society. No one could own land. The verses from the Torah that I brought at the beginning also included, we didn't read it explicitly, that you cannot sell the land in perpetuity. You can only lease land for 49 years. We're not going to talk about Yovel, about Jubilee today, but it's also connected to Shemitah. So the idea that for regulating marketplaces to be equitable, one also has to engage in price fixing and prevent price gouging. There is still a certain amount of trust that we believe shop owners, we believe business when they say, this is how much I got it for, and this is how much I'm selling it for. And to recognize that that there is a difference between luxury goods and essentials. And people should have the ability to engage in free market. People should have the ability to take their resources and turn them into financial resources if they so choose to. But we can't allow for that marketplace to even further elevate the hunger that the agricultural equity is seeking to address. Any questions about anything that we've talked about that might have come up? Okay. So I'd like to hear from folks, like when you hear the term tzedakah, what do you think of? What's the image in your head? What's your experience with tzedakah? I feel like a lot of folks in Jewish communities have like warm fuzzies about tzedakah. It's like a very early Jewish experience that many people have. Anyone have a tzedakah story that they care to share? Anyone ever participate themselves or have folks in their family that used to go door to door with the JNF blue tzedakah boxes?
Yep.
Did you go, Jonathan, when you were a kid with your family?
We didn't go door to door, but I remember we had them in elementary school. We had them, and I would go around collecting for them. I don't know if I went door to door, but I remember like they're kind of ubiquitous. I feel like everybody had one.
Yeah. Show of hands, anyone had a JNF tzedakah box in their house? Wow. So the will someone give their definition of tzedakah?
My understanding, I was very impressed when you used the word equity, because that is pretty much what I was taught, was that it was each according to his need. So it's not equal, it's equity. And equity also means according to what they are able to do to so-called earn it. So when you're doing the gleaning, if you are able, of course, then you literally go out and glean, but you're given it if you cannot physically do that work. So I do like equity rather than equal. It's subsidization, you have that, rather than a gifting or anything like that. It's to subsidize what they can do. And so then it's an honorable thing. It's just the way it's who we are, rather than a charity type of idea.
And I think one of the essential components to understanding it's not charity because it's not optional, right? You don't have a choice. The most profound lesson in tzedakah that I ever received when I lived in Los Angeles, there, if people have spent any time in West LA, there's a Jewish neighborhood usually referred to by the major intersection at its center, Pico Robertson, and it's a highly concentrated, dense Jewish neighborhood, and there's a number of kosher markets and restaurants and all in the same place. And so Friday afternoons are a madhouse, and a lot of very observant people, and a lot of Persians. And on Friday afternoons, many home insecure people would stand outside of the various markets and wine stores and bakeries because there was so much activity. And so the level of tzedakah that they would get in those hours was greater. And there's a tradition to give extra tzedakah before Shabbat. And so they would congregate there. And there was a time that and you would, if you lived in the neighborhood, you would see them and get to know them personally sometimes. And there was a man that was frequent in the area, and I watched him receive $1, go inside to the store, buy a bottle of water, take a dime and give it to someone else. And he took 10% of the tzedakah that he received and he gave it to someone else. And I was just so blown away. Right. And the phrase that Zafira, is that how you pronounce your name? Is that correct?
I pronounce it Zafira.
Zafira. Great.
Yeah.
Zafira.
Like a tsunami.
Zafira mentioned, I think alluded to, we don't give tzedakah to the point that we need to be recipient of tzedakah. Right. And so that just, it completely, that experience of watching this man receive $1 in tzedakah, purchase a product from the store, and then take a dime and give it as tzedakah, just, it made it so real that this isn't charity. And that the idea of what one is able to give is relative in that psychological and sociological phenomenon that I referenced at the beginning, that someone that has resources and feels the vulnerability and anxiety of not having those resources is more likely to protect those resources than to provide those resources. And someone who does not have those resources is more likely to provide those resources. And I think, as I mentioned, the cornerstone of Torah economics as empathy, then all of a sudden, it's not a question of I'm doing this against my best interest because I'm supposed to, but I'm doing this in my best interest because I have to. Because either just empathetically, because we're humans and we can feel that emotion, or because we know I might have already experienced, or have the possibility to experience in the future. And so tzedakah, I don't really know if I began thinking about as subsidization until recently, in trying to understand, again, like, what is the value that is being presented here, in how do these structures, and tzedakah sits separate from these other structures that we've looked at, right? And so I just kind of want to go through an overview, because we digested a lot, right, in the last hour. And so the idea of Shemitah as this period of remission, recognizing that the agricultural remission begins a few months before the conclusion of the previous year, right? So any activity that you would be engaged in, so the question gets raised in the Mishnah, how until when can I plow in the sixth year, right? And the response is, as long as it helps the trees. Right? There's a point at which your activity in the fields is not actually going to encourage the growth in a natural way. It's going to encourage the growth in a interventional way. And so that's when we stop. And Jewish law being Jewish law, of course, there's two opinions that are presented. And one is until it benefits the trees, and the other is until Shavuot. And then it's clarified that those are actually the same time, just so we're clear, right? But we're measuring it by different things, right? Does Shemitah become a hard stop because the calendar changes, right? You have until Shavuot. Doesn't really matter what's going on in your real life. Shavuot is Shavuot. Or until, it's no longer benefiting the trees naturally, right? So that idea of Shemitah only works if we prepare. We can't just prepare for Shemitah by growing extra food because of the way that food is distributed. And so to create the system of tithing, to ensure that there is a basic foundational, just like these are your basic needs, this percentage of food that is designated to the needy will at least be enough for bread. And to ensure through the process of the agricultural givings that the vulnerable and the needy have access and agency to the produce that will come to be theirs that they already own but don't yet have physical access to. That they have the ability to be in relationship with it, and that relationship to the farmer does not negatively impact the farmer's economic experience in an unnecessary amount. And so that we try and strive for that balance, for stability, so that we can have a marketplace grounded in empathy. And that recognition of the inherent instability and insecurity of the economics, of any economic system, right? And again, ancestors were not living under capitalism. These structures are not created to address the systemic challenges of capitalism. But the values that are inherent in any aspect of this inherited wisdom can be applied to address those if we can isolate what those values are. And so as it relates to building a society that allows for Shemitah to happen, what is tzedakah? And it's not JNF blue boxes. So the idea of tzedakah, I think, like, we often think about the collecting of small amounts, or the giving of the dollar outside of the market, or the giving of the dime from that change, right? We think about it's when tzedakah is when you pull into your pocket. My personal favorite tzedakah experience that I ever had, I was 15, maybe 14. I think I was 15, and I was at the Kotel. I was at the Western Wall. I grew up very, very, very secular, and really knew little to nothing about religious life, and I'm doing what you're supposed to do at the hotel, and I have my eyes closed and my head is against the wall, and I'm like trying to have some kind of spiritual experience, and this, I have like someone taps me on the shoulder, and I look, and there's this like little short guy, big black hat, and he's just like, come on, and he like pulls me into this little in the corner on the men's side of the western wall is this little like alcove, and they have carts with prayer books and tefillin, and he just starts like putting tefillin on my arm, and he like guides me through saying the Shema, and I'm like, wow, this is so cool, and all these things. He takes off the tefillin and he just puts out his hand, and I take some shekels out of my pocket, and I put it in his hand, and he just sits there and he's just waiting with the open hand with the coin still in it, and I take out some more. He emptied my entire pocket. It was awesome. And then he walked away, and I'm like, are you kidding me? Like, this is the great spiritual experience that a Jewish teenager has. But again, like that idea of tzedakah, when it comes to creating equity in our economy, is not anything other than a stopgap. And we use it as a stopgap when the other systems that we have don't meet the needs of the individual. Because no matter what structure is built, structures only address structures. They might be able to address larger systemic issues, but they can't address the need of every individual. And so we have this wonderful text in the Talmud that speaks of an independently wealthy rabbi who is able, through his influence, to manipulate the marketplace. And I love this idea. Every overcast day, he would go out in a golden carriage and he would survey the entire city. Why is it relevant that it's overcast? You want to throw it in the chat or unmute yourself and chime in if you have an idea. Why is it relevant that it's overcast? He's concerned that it might rain. And if it rains and you're living in, this would be, if it's Rav Huna, this would be 3rd, 4th century Persian Babylon, right? What's he concerned about? That like the mud walls are going to collapse. So he goes through the city, he's investing in walls. And he says to the people, that wall needs to be torn down right now, right? And through his power and influence, because of his wealth, they would either listen to him or he would force them to. But if they couldn't pay for it, then he would pay for it, right? So influence can't just come with force. It has to also come with empathy. It can't just come with demand. It has to also come with compassion. And so the manipulation of the marketplace, so to speak, the manipulation in this case of public infrastructure, the funding of public infrastructure, when there's not enough public funding, then the people who have the wealth and the influence, right, could be in a position of respect in the community that people actually listen to them and pay when they need to fix their own wall, or can name that they can't. And then the text moves into the actual marketplace and presents a scene in which Rav Huna sends people to purchase all of the food that is left at the end of the market day and dispose of it in the river. Right? This is direct marketplace subsidization. This is no different than the Farm Bill and the US government paying farmers not to grow food. Right? Why is he doing this? So that they don't bring too much of one thing one day and then not bring it the next, or he's able to balance supply and demand so that the market functions, the customers come and the farmers leave and everyone gets what they need. But the intervention is so severe. And the text concludes, when he
He would throw all of this food in the river. But every time that he served a meal, he would open his door to anybody who needed to. Right? So that the power and wealth and influence is only of value when it's contributing to the stability and not contributing to the inequality. And the response to this idea, right? The Talmud is a conversation with itself. The response to this idea that, oh, look how great this rich man was that he could feed the whole world, is like, you want me to do this? You think that I can emulate these behaviors? Like there's no way I can feed people, right? That moment in the Passover Seder, I mean, like it's so strangely ironic in American suburbia of supposed to open up your door and scream out, let anyone who is hungry come and eat. Like there's not even anyone out there to hear it. And if there were, would you actually invite them in? Are you prepared to do that emotionally? Are you prepared to do that financially? Are you prepared to actually invite the food insecure people in your community to your Passover table? I'm not saying that we should be. It's just the reality. What does it actually mean financially to feed people? And the recognition that not every person is able to be the marketplace manipulator, and not every person should be the marketplace manipulator. Part of marketplace manipulation is not just rich people subsidizing things, but is also the community subsidizing things. That is another form of marketplace manipulation. Manipulation not in the judgment sense, but just in the sense of it's this way right now, and if I do this to it, then it's going to be that way, right? And so in addition to the agricultural components of these structures of ensuring that the poor had access to resources, there was also financial resources and immediate food triage, immediate food resources, right? So in addition to these givings of gifts, there was a food pantry, a communal soup kitchen, and a monetary fund that was distributed. There are also like smaller community level funds, collective funds that still exist today in many Jewish communities. But there's all of these more charitably driven, but still not charity because it's tzedakah, distribution of resources, right? And the ways in which they ensured the stability of the distribution of those resources, again, always trying to ensure fairness and equity for the giving, for those who are giving and those who are receiving. And the more people that you add in the mix, the more opportunity for corruption and complexities causing disruptions. And so the structures that are put in place to ensure the fair distribution of goods, right, is an essential component. But how do we deal with interpersonal relationships? How do we deal with like the one-on-one tensions that arise in our economic and agricultural relationships with each other that lead to that anxiety in Shemitah that we say, what are we going to eat when we can't grow food, right? How do we mitigate the experience of the anxiety of lack just in our interpersonal relationships? And so this second text on the bottom from also from Baba Batra, this idea of is it fair to control the business of a neighboring and competing business? And so the text here has a scenario in which two butchers agree that they're going to do different parts of their jobs on different days to ensure that they both maximize their resources, right? Like the idea of like, you know, you can have too many of one commodity in one town. And so the idea of dividing those resources fairly, and what happens when someone doesn't. And there's this court case that happens, and essentially what we have here in this text that says they came before Rava, meaning that they came to court, and Rava's acting as this judge, and Rava makes his ruling, but there's an objection that's raised in the court, and the objection is that communities have the right to enforce fines if people are violating their community norms. In other words, what do you do when someone doesn't fit into the structures that are ensuring the stability and wellness of this community and society, and the idea of having communal norms? And this really fascinating reaction that the case essentially gets thrown out, right? And the reason that it is thrown out at that point is to say that communities only have the ability to issue their own regulations in the absence of a person of influence. We don't have enough time to get into like the true dissection of what this is trying to say. But how I'm reading it, in light of everything that we've talked about, is that a person who has that influence and wealth is obligated to give of it, not unfairly, but equitably, and to use that influence so that the community doesn't have to. Again, it's a different model, right? This, I think, is so counterintuitive to us. But imagine if, for example, hypothetically speaking, just imagine, it's going to be really hard, that there is a global pandemic and people are losing their jobs left and right, and everyone is stuck in their homes. And there's like 5 people, and those 5 people, because of the businesses that they had built somewhat fairly and probably legally, happened to get more resources during that global pandemic, resources that even most nations could not imagine, that if those people funded the subsidization and relief instead of the taxed governments. That's, I think, what this text on the bottom is offering. That there are people of such great influence that their responsibility to ensure the equity and empathy that is the foundation of the marketplace, that they have that added responsibility, not in the other forms of giving. Their tithes are 10% just like everybody else's. Their paya is a minimum of 1/60th just like everybody else's. Their profit of commodities is 1/6 just like everybody else's. The law is the law and is applied equally to everybody. But tzedakah, when it comes to this level of subsidization, that's not systemic but is immediate, perhaps there are other responsibilities that become inherent through that influence. And then, of course, I'm sure this is a text also. This presentation features Maimonides numerous times. That's not common for me, but Rambam's 8 levels of tzedakah. This is the tzedakah that most of us are used to giving. This is the tzedakah in your pocket. But when we really delve deep inside of what these levels are, it's seeking for dignity, right? That once we get to this level of interventionist tzedakah, the driving imperative is to maintain dignity of all parties. And to me, this is again an embodiment of the value of that inherent empathy as the foundation of economics. And so Shemitah, in the absence of these structures of tithes, of agricultural givings, of just marketplace, and of just subsidization, Shemitah, in the absence of these structures, is cruel. It's cruel to farmers and it's cruel to consumers, and it does not work. When Shemitah became directly relevant again for contemporary modern Jewish life, the first Shemitah that really became relevant again was the Gregorian year of 1888. This was the first time that the application of the law to permit selling of land to non-Jews so that the land could continue to be farmed was ever used. This concept of transferring ownership to someone who is not obligated under Jewish law is not unique to Shemitah. In fact, we do it at Passover, right? We sell our chametz to non-Jews, and this has been done for more than 2,000 years. But it wasn't until 1888, of all of the years of Shemitah being observed before the exile, of all of the years of Shemitah being observed, even when there were only 50 Jewish families in the land of Israel, the farmers were still observing Shemitah. By the time that you get to the 1300s, and there's a few thousand Jewish families, they're observing Shemitah. By the time that you get to the 1700s, and there's maybe 5,000 Jewish families in the land of Israel, they're observing Shemitah. What happens in 1888 that's different than all of the Shemitah cycles before? The first Aliyah. All of the immigrants from Europe are moving so that by the time you get to 1888, there's almost 40,000 Jewish families. There haven't been that many Jewish farmers in Israel for hundreds of years, and there hadn't been that many Jewish consumers who need to be concerned about Shemitah. And so it's fascinating to look at what happens when now 21st century, how does Israel deal with Shemitah other than this sales permit? I remember 2 Shemitah cycles ago, there was a big movement to import soil from other places and just like put it on top of plastic, right? Because you can still farm, but you're not farming in Israel, right? Or to use synthetic soils, hydroponics, all sorts of different, these really weird applications of loopholes in the law, without ever addressing why is Shemitah causing hunger now instead of relieving it, right? And so again, like for me, none of this is about the replicability of what a Bronze Age or Iron Age semi-urban, semi-agrarian society was engaging in practically, nor am I concerned about the application of halakha and Jewish law in these terms, but that there is deep wisdom inherent in these structures that theoretically we should be able to tap into and be inspired by to express our values and how we're confronting the challenges today. And so for me, as we are moving through this 6th year, the questions that I'm really asking myself is, in the Shemitah year of 5782, how can I begin to build structures within my community, my immediate community, that reflect and embody the beauty of the wisdom of our ancestral tradition, not just for its perpetuity and continuity, but because it seems to be of deep relevance. We just have to tweak it. So they do have some time if there are questions. I'm happy to draw it out for 8 more minutes. Been a relatively quiet group, but if there's any questions, I'm happy to share the slideshow if folks would like that. I can actually get that prepared to do right now. But yeah, if anyone has any questions, comments. Well, here is a link to the slideshow for those that might be interested. And again, thank you for the opportunity to share this time with your community. Thank you for regularly hosting and highlighting programs this year about Shemitah, but also all of the other offerings that Urban Adamah does. It's an amazing offering to the world and the Jewish people. Thank you for coming, each of you. And I think Tessa has some things to share with you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Justin, for imparting your knowledge and wisdom and sharing that with us in this last hour or so. It's really, really interesting stuff. I was recording this, so if anybody is interested in watching it back or that want to review the slides, those are available too.